Hi, you're tuning to Ceasefire magazine, and today I'm joined by writer, activist, and hip hop artist Akala. Akala, thanks for coming and speaking to Ceasefire today.
No problem at all.
I want to begin by asking you about the UK riots, but more specifically about the reaction of the criminal justice system and what it says about the nature of the state today and the prison system itself.
And what we're talking about specifically, the 24-hour courts, the mandatory sentencing, the 18 months for stealing a bottle of water, all of these kind of things. Well, there was a statement, I believe it was Richard Nixon. He made a statement, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was, the entire problem is the blacks. And the key is to have a system that recognises that without appearing to do so. This is speaking specifically in reference to the war on drugs. And I'm going to give this as a prequel because America is Britain's best friend. So I think it's important that we recognise that best friends, birds of a feather, flock together. And so you look at something like the war on drugs where on the face of it, we just want to rid the country of drugs, But in reality, you have a situation where the primary drug users in America are middle-class white teenagers. This isn't me being horrible, this is a fact. You have an industry that is a $100 billion a year industry. So clearly the main beneficiaries of it financially don't live in the ghettos of Compton or Harlem or wherever else. But you have a situation where you can use the issue of drugs to imprison a particular undesirable population in a prison system that is becoming a privatized for-profit venture. And we have to look back in history to inform us. And this is all important to the British point, so I'm going to develop the point a little bit. When slavery finished in the United States, you had a lot of people believe slavery finished, let's say, with the passing of the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution. What actually happened was slavery was made illegal except for people who had committed a criminal offence could now be legally enslaved. And so overnight, the prison system in America went from being almost totally white, because Africans were all but the overwhelming majority were slaves, to being overwhelmingly African American overnight. And it was a for-profit system. It was something that's called convict leasing, because these former African slaves that were now homeless, vagabondage was made a crime, for example. Small property theft carried a mandatory minimum. And these Africans were then re-enslaved and sold back to the very same plantations they'd come from under a system called convict leasing. Following on that came chain gangs. And so these were all means of perpetuating the enslavement of African American males, particularly, who were looked upon as a potentially revolutionary part of the population, and also had been the main source of American labor for quite some time. And that situation continues in the States today, where you have now the war on drugs being used. And people can feel good about it. What it does is it eases the conscience. They can say, yeah, but they took drugs, they sold drugs, they deserve to be in jail. The fact that crack cocaine got 100 times the sentence, 100 times more severely sentenced than powder cocaine, should tell us something about who was perceived to be using which drug. Which brings us forward to a situation like what we have in the UK, not just with the riots, but with gangs and with all these other buzzwords that we use. When people speak about gangs, are they talking about football hooligans who've been routinely bashing each other up for the last 30 or 40 years? Week in, week out in every city in this country? Are they talking about the gangs of Glasgow? I'm half Scottish. I can tell you that young working class white boys in Glasgow stab each other pretty regularly. Is that the gangs they're speaking of? Is there a specific drive to put those people in prisons? I don't know. It doesn't appear to be the case. And so you can use buzzwords like gangs, like riot, etc. And the society can know what it's talking about without feeling the guilt of having to come out and say this is the target. And so when we look at the aftermath of something like the August riots, when we have a country in which so-called ethnic minorities are already disproportionately sentenced for the same crimes as their white counterparts, not according to me, but according to every study done, you now have a situation where these riots go on in particular areas, and the reaction to them is in complete contrast to the smashing up of Miliband last year, when the students rioted, for example. Why weren't those people all given mandatory sentences in prison? Why weren't they called savages and animals in the press, etc., etc., etc.? Because the composition of who they were perceived to be versus the composition of who these riots was perceived to be was ethnically different, in my view. Not that in reality there weren't young white children, including middle-class white children, out there smashing up stuff. There were. But reality, if your parents can afford attorneys, or if you're lawyers, or your parents are connected or whatever else, you're still far less likely to be sentenced. And so what the so-called justice system gets to do then is to imprison a whole bunch of people that it considers socially undesirable. And now we have in Britain for-profit prisons, just like in the United States. And so the apparent impotence of the police because I don't believe they were genuinely impotent to defend themselves from what was going on. We all saw the footage and it was like, well, since when have the police been shy to bust a black youth's head, you know? But all of a sudden the police got shy to bust a black youth's head, which was interesting to me. But the way that all of that was portrayed in the media and the way those scenes were repeated over and over again and the fires that we saw and all that, laid the justification for what is already an unjust system to become more unjust. And young, particularly African Caribbean males, need to be aware of the game that's played on them. And other areas of the society are complicit in this. You know, rap music's complicit in this, promoting this idea that it's kind of cool to go to prison. You know, but it's private prisons now. It means private, rich, predominantly white-owned companies are making money off young black males thinking it's cool to go jail, and somehow they're repping their ends by going jail. And so all of that is the context in which something like August occurs, and then the aftermath to August is not to spend more money on relations between, say, the police and the community, not to spend resources on greater education or greater employment or greater social participation, but no, to spend more money putting people in prison, because we would prefer you in prison than we would you at university. It's just that simple. Our society mandates that we prefer particular groups of people to end up in particular destinations and particular others to end up in others. And if that's going to be the outcome, we have to engineer social inequality. And the justice system is one of the key ways in which you can do that. And I believe that, in the long and short of it, explains the reaction that we got in August.
On a popular grime blog, Grime Daily, there's a show called Crep Check, where grime and UK hip-hop artists show what new trainers and footwear they have. You did a show called Book Check, where you talked about the different books you're reading at the moment. Taking this into consideration, what do you think the role is of the black intellectual in Britain today?
I think the black intellectual's job is what it's always been, you know, to articulate, or as I would prefer to say, the African intellectual's job is to articulate from an African perspective worldviews, ideas, philosophies, for the betterment of their group of people and humanity as a whole. You know, if something's intelligent and works for a particular group of people and helps with more effective social management, economic management, and people relations, the whole of humanity can benefit from that. You know, millions of people practice Indian yoga, you know, because they feel it spiritually helps them somehow. You know, that doesn't change the fact that it's Indian. You know, and Indian people invented that, and if we respect that culture, we should acknowledge that. Well, to me, the African intellectual, be he at home in Africa or in the diaspora somewhere, his function or her function is to articulate to the best of their knowledge from their cultural roots, not from someone else's cultural roots. And this has been the problem, I think, historically. The information that is readily available to us today about the history of black people, African people in the world, wasn't available 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago as freely as it is today. So you had a lot of black revolutionaries identify with Marxism or various other European doctrines that I think have some useful parts, but are very anti-African in their philosophy. Essentially, you know, they are very historically naive and they don't take into account the non-European world experience. They take European experience to be world experience. We can't afford to make that mistake because the experience of the Caribbean or Africa or Native Americans, for example, is radically different. Europe today is in the greatest place it's ever been materially, right? Economically. It's at the apex of its power. Africa's had several eras that are better than today's. So if we view history as linear, for example, you know, for African people that doesn't work because it isn't linear and we're not going towards progress ending up at the end. Africa's been on a downward spiral for about half a millennia now, you know. But there's every reason to think that spiral can go back upwards. So I would say for intellectuals of African Caribbean heritage, unless we're grounded in knowledge of our history, our culture, where we come from, a particular worldview, the social relations, the mores, the folkways of our communities, we're not really fulfilling our perspective. We're just sort of a cheap imitation of something else. Obviously, we've been educated. If we live in Britain, we've been educated in Britain. We would have learned certain things about British society. We should take what's useful that we've been exposed to in this country, but still speak from a perspective grounded in our own history, knowledge of self and culture, and try and spread that to the everyday, find forms and ways of spreading that to the everyday person. Part of the problem with the so-called intelligentsia is this kind of elitist, you know, anti-people way in which things can be presented sometimes. I've got nothing against dissertations and reading books and things being complicated, but I think we have to have many layers and many levels, and we have to have ways of communicating with everybody, whatever level they're at, and bringing people in, and to make intelligence sexy. That's ultimately what it boils down to. You know, the reason why the particular groups in the world are where they are today. Let's take China, for example. You know, it's because China's made Chinese culture sexy to Chinese people. There's a reason to be Chinese right now and to look back at Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching or, the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu or the Water Margin, or any of these texts that are the foundational basis for a Chinese worldview. They've made it sexy again. It's cool to go back into your culture and your history and to reinterpret that to create modern Chinese power. Well, we have to make our history and culture sexy and normal and okay and not appear radical. I mean, what the hell does that mean? The idea that it's radical for a people to know, or that they're Afrocentric, you know, because they know something about African history is completely absurd. You know, Greece, look how many thousands of miles away from England Greece is. Still, English universities have no problem teaching people that Plato and Socrates are their intellectual ancestors, right? But they don't, Anglo-Saxon people are not descended from Greeks. But still, they feel that within that European conversation, that's their intellectual ancestors. Well, why is it absurd then for people of African heritage to look back to the texts of Ife or the Book of the Dead or Nubia or the whole kingdoms of the Nile or the Mandingo Empire, you know, for our intellectual inspiration? There's nothing absurd about that at all. It's perfectly healthy and normal. And anyone who's an intelligent person or a fair person would say that's a normal, intelligent thing for a group of people to do.
We talked a lot about international history already, but you've also linked a lot with artists from places like Latin America and Africa. What do you think the significance is of linking up with artists and other people across the globe?
Well, if you're only against oppression when it affects your people, you're not really against oppression at all, or what you perceive to be your people. So to me, you know, all over the world, human beings are suffering, not by accident, not because of nature, not because of accidental famine, because other human beings are greedy, you know. Simple, you know, and so to me, if we're not making those alliances all over the world to try and create, I believe it's possible, you know, that's the bottom line. This is what I believe in. I believe that we have the technology, the know-how, and many of us have the desire to create a more just world than the one we currently live in. And I truly believe that is possible. But if we're only concerned with our, you know, parochial, local suffering in London, you know, or Manchester or Birmingham or the UK as a whole, and once we solve that, don't worry about Africa or the Caribbean or South America or the Middle East, to hell with all of them, well, we're not really against oppression at all. And you see that quite a lot with, particularly with middle class people of colour here and in the United States. People's kind of vibe generally is like, oh, I'm doing all right, you know. Who cares what they do in the Caribbean, you know? Who cares, you know, how many American troops are in Africa, you know? I'm doing all right, I got a Bentley, you know, I got a nice car, what are you complaining about? And to me, I mean, that mentality says, well, we're not really against oppression at all. We were against oppression when it was people in America being hung from trees in public and burned, you know, and now that it's not as obvious and in your face, and in some ways it is in your face, but if you're a middle class African American now, and you're not against oppression anymore because it doesn't directly affect you, well, you weren't really against oppression in the first place. You just wanted a better life for yourself, but you're no longer concerned with the rest of the world. So again, I think it's important to make allegiances and to want for everybody the rights that you want for yourself and the living standard that you want for yourself. And we have the resources. The idea that there's not enough to go around on this planet is bollocks. Anyone who's done even a little bit of reading, you know, or taken even a cursory glance at the resources available on this earth today knows there's more than enough to go around. It's just some people want everything and others, you know, are left having nothing. I mean, cats and dogs in this country and in America eat better food than most people on the planet Earth. I mean, I was walking in Notting Hill the other day, and they've got a spa for cats and dogs. Think about that. A spa where cats and dogs go to get massages and shampooed and creamed and all kind of other madness. I mean, get their nails clipped. What the fuck is that about, by the way? And I'm not dissing people who've got pets, whatever, but I'm just saying, when you tell me there ain't enough resources to go around in this planet, and there's a fucking cat and dog spa in Notting Hill, I'm not, it's bollocks, bruv, I'm not having it.
You've talked a lot how, throughout history, things change and nothing is ever static. Taking that into consideration, what are your hopes for the changes in society, whether it be a total upheaval or revolution itself?
Well, revolution is change, you know, and so change is inevitable. And I think that from the limited amount of history I've studied, it seems to me, unless we destroy the entire planet, which is a possibility, I don't think we can write that off, the world is slowly changing. It can often be easy to look at the suffering that exists in large parts of the world and assume that means there's no progress being made. But actually, as I believe it was Stokely Carmichael was saying, when the enemy has to do so much, it shows you're actually winning, you know. when they used opium in China to try and destroy the Chinese people. And China repelled that and eventually has repaired itself to a certain degree. Of course, there's millions of problems in China like there is anywhere else, but certainly China is in a far better position today than it was at the end of the Opium Wars, for example. Well, when drugs are continually pumped into African American and African British communities and people are being imprisoned and all these kind of actions, these preemptive strikes are being made, what that says is the power structure fears a particular group of people and knows that this particular group of people represents change, whether that be average working class poor people, whether it be African Caribbean people, whether it be women, whoever it is. And so to me, the actions that are being taken and people's reaction to that will inevitably lead to change. But us not knowing history means that we think nothing's changed. So we're taught slavery ended because a bunch of middle class white guys in Parliament decided to pass a bill, which is complete bollocks. Without the Haitian Revolution, without the Maroons, without the American Revolution, without the whole change in the economic systems at the time that was going on, but primarily without Africans, the enslaved people shedding their blood to free themselves, they probably wouldn't be free today, And you only have to look at the actions after the so-called 1807, when the slave masters got 20 million compensation. The Africans that they apparently felt so bad about enslaving didn't get a penny, So clearly it wasn't about us feeling bad, Indians continued to be shipped from India to come and work in the Caribbean, and Africans in Africa were then enslaved, in what we cleverly call colonialism. But colonialism in Africa was just the extension of transatlantic slavery. It was just slavery of Africans inside Africa. So when you understand that history, you realize things that were not supposed to change have changed, and that oppressed groups of people have continually forced change throughout history. And one of the ways oppressors keep the image of their kind of all-seeing, all-dominating power is by pretending that even when oppressed people did force change, they, oh no, it was just because we felt bad, we just felt really bad and we decided to free you. But in reality, knowing that the efforts of people in Haiti 200 years ago are part of why I can even sit here and have this conversation with you. And to me, one of the most distressing things is when you see, particularly, for me, only because it's the community I see and interact with, so much African Caribbean people that somehow think they don't owe anything to black people. And I'm just like, well, you must be crazy. You're able to walk down the street without Teddy Boys punching you in your face today because the battles our dads fought. Whether you like that or not, that's the reality. You can go around and act like because you got a little platinum chain and a nice car that you're somebody special and you're better than your community. But the bottom line is, without other black people shedding blood, you'd still be getting your head bust by Teddy Boys right now. So you do owe your community something, whether you like it or not. And that's the same in a historical sense. And so I think by being cognizant of that and taking time to appreciate what people have done, so we could sit here and pontificate in front of a camera and have a nice conversation, and go downstairs and drink tea. Understanding all of that, I think, compels us to have a responsibility to continue pushing it forward. But revolution is inevitable. Revolution can't go backwards. You can't have a system built on lies and deception and murder and it lasts forever and ever and ever. And we look at today and we look around at the technology and we get depressed and we say, but they've got atom bombs today, There's no way to defeat them. I'm sure people believe the same about Rome. I'm sure people believe the same in ancient Greece. I'm sure people believe the same in ancient Egypt. It could never fall. They were building skyscrapers thousands of years before most of the rest of the planet had even written a book. Right? I'm sure people living in Egypt thought the Pharaoh's never going to fall. The Pharaoh's God, in fact. Look, could you imagine 5,000 years ago what it must have looked like building something like the Great Pyramid? Which was the tallest building on earth till about 150 years ago. And so I think it's us realizing that oppressors are completely fallible and their position depends wholly on our complicity in the system. I'm complicit. I'm under no illusion about that. I'm just trying to figure out how best to use my complicity to play the tiniest part I can play in bringing about justice.
Thanks so much for talking to Ceasefire magazine today, Akala. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you. Pleasure.